Hello, everyone, and welcome to the program. Life is a story we tell ourselves. Today, we have with us Secretary Crowfoot, who is the California Natural Resources Secretary. Wade Crowfoot became California Natural Resources Secretary in January of 2019, appointed by Governor Gavin Newsom. Secretary Crowfoot oversees an agency of 21,000 employees who protect and manage California's natural environment. This includes stewarding the state's forests and natural lands, rivers and waterways, and coast and oceans, protecting fish and wildlife, and overseeing energy development. As a member of the governor's cabinet, he advises Governor Newsom on natural resources and environmental issues. Secretary Crowfoot firmly believes that good natural resource management helps natural places thrive and allows communities and our economy to prosper. Prior to serving as Secretary Crowfoot led the Water Foundation, a nonprofit philanthropy that builds shared water solutions across the American West. Before that, Secretary Crowfoot served in Governor Jerry Brown's administration as Deputy Cabinet Secretary and Senior Advisor to the Governor. He also previously served as West Coast Regional Director for the Environmental Defense Fund and a Senior Environmental Advisor to the then San Francisco Mayor Gavin Newsom. Secretary Crowfoot received a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1996 and earned a master's degree in public policy from the London School of Economics in 2004, graduating with honors, I might add. A native of Michigan, Secretary Crowfoot grew up spending his summers outdoors at a YMCA camp and at his family's remote cabin in northern Ontario. When he moved to California in the mid-1990s, he became an avid hiker and backpacker. Secretary Crowfoot marks his first time in the Redwoods at Big Basin State Park as one of his defining California moments. Now he spends his time outside of work, exploring, hiking, and camping with his wife, Lisa, and their young daughter. Secretary Crowfoot, welcome to the program. So good to see you.
Oh, it's great to be with you, Don, and look forward to the conversation here.
Yeah, so first I want to say, our hearts and minds and thoughts and prayers are with all of the people in California that are suffering through yet another storm and another battering and flooding, and I know there's been loss of life. Why don't you take a minute and tell us how things are going there in California? I know my listeners would love to get a real update.
Sure thing. Well, California is an extraordinary state, and it also has extraordinary weather. So, we're a Mediterranean climate, so we have a dry season and a wet season. And, naturally, we're prone to some level of drought as well as winter flooding. So folks are accustomed to these big storms coming off the Pacific. But we know that climate change is supercharging, both the dry periods and the wet periods. So we find ourselves in a really strange situation. We're moving into the fourth year of a drought, and this is a really intense drought. The last 3 years have been the driest 3-year period in the state's history. And at the same time, we're right in the middle of a series of what are called atmospheric rivers, where there's just a belt of intense moisture coming off the Pacific. So we have this challenge where we're managing limited water supply, but at the same time, over the last couple of weeks, dealing with far too much water at once. Right. I'm coming to this conversation from 20 floors up in our headquarters in Sacramento, looking out of the window as we just get pelted with another storm. And so the short of it is that, Californians are resilient, and our government is really focused on helping us adjust to what will be more intense climate change impacts. So that's really what we're facing right now.
Right. Well, now that you mentioned climate change, I was going to talk about this a little bit earlier, and I know you've been interviewed on this probably a million times, but you made a viral statement back in 2020, kind of challenging President Trump's notion that was basically denying science and climate change. And I just wanted to get your thoughts real quick, since you mentioned climate change, about, we have so many political people who still deny the science behind climate change. And here, where I'm in Ecuador, I've led science seminars to promote science literacy for almost the last 10 years. And And I tell you, it's an uphill battle trying to get people to understand science. What's it been like for you since that conversation?
Well, I would say a couple things. First of all, in California, we really feel like we're on the front lines of climate change. So, we've had catastrophic wildfire that's at times seemed like an existential threat. We had our longest, hottest heat wave in the state's history just a few months ago. And of course, the drought and flooding we just talked about. So in California, really any debate is over. Now, of course, there's not all of our residents agree, but our policymakers, our leaders are all focused on adjusting to climate change and leading the world, actually showing what we need to do to reduce the pollution that causes climate change. But of course, in the United States, we're somewhat unique as a country and as a government where there is this political debate on climate change. If you go to most other governments around the world, there's no debate. There may be disagreement around how to address climate change, but certainly not a debate about whether it's happening. But as you say, Don, for people that are worried about, the funding or the salary that they're bringing home or putting food on the table, climate change historically has felt like an abstract threat, and it's sort of an invisible threat and really hard to feel. I think that's changing around the world, and I think we're seeing that, and I think the media is really helping us connect dots. So, there will be those climate deniers, and as we know, the climate denial industry, a little bit like the cigarette industry, where, for decades they've sown doubt because that impacts their ability to make, tons of money. We see that with the oil industry around the world. I think we're breaking through that. So I think it's not a question of, if the world, if the United States, if California will take action, it's how we're going to do it and if we're going to do it quickly enough.
Yeah, I understand. Well, this is Life is a Story We Tell Ourselves podcast, and I have a lot of fun talking to people about, what influenced them to begin their life's journey. So kind of my initial question in that regard has to do with, was there a singular moment or event, that stands out above all others, in your life that started you down this environmental protection path?
Like a lot of people, I didn't plan my career in advance, and it evolved, over jobs and time to the position I have now. But I have had a chance to reflect on why I do the work I do. And for me, it started as a kid, having an opportunity with my family to spend a month every summer up in Northern Ontario in a cabin that we owned without running water and electricity. And it was those memories, which were my best memories to childhood: fishing, hiking, blueberry picking, just running around the North Woods, that really, I think, sowed my love for the environment. My dad actually spent his career as a professor of natural resources, mostly at the University of Michigan. So as I look back on it, that was, of course, an influence as well. But Don, growing up, I think a lot of kids don't intend to follow in their parents' footsteps. So this is not the job I would have anticipated in my teenage or early 20s.
All right. No, I understand. And I understand about kids not necessarily following in their parents' footsteps, although my oldest daughter, who was also at the summit that you were just at in Canada, is an environmental scientist, and she had some of the same experiences, of course, that you did growing up in parks. So I know how that can be infectious growing up in the environment like that. I certainly understand all of those influences in your life leading you to where you are today. But what specifically led to you becoming a secretary? What were some of the events that led up to you ending up as secretary in the most populous state, and the state that has some of the most biodiversity on the planet?
Well, it's definitely my dream job. It's a job I never thought I'd have a chance to be in. For about 20 years ago, I started working with Gavin Newsom when he was mayor in San Francisco. And for those of you who are not in California or don't follow California, Gavin Newsom is now our governor. Actually, this week he'll be inaugurated into his second and final term as governor. And he is a really ambitious, creative leader. And working with him in San Francisco, I started in a couple of different jobs, but ultimately became his environmental advisor. And those were days, boy, early mid, 2004 through 2010, 2009. Those were days when San Francisco was really leading the way on urban sustainability and climate change. And it was incredible. We did so much. I transitioned from that and I worked for an environmental NGO, the Environmental Defense Fund, which was an incredible experience. And they were really driving national and international climate and environmental policy. And then from that, I actually worked for the previous governor, Jerry Brown, who, while very different than Gavin Newsom, is huge warrior on all things environmental and climate change. And I actually worked in the governor's office driving that agenda. So when Governor Newsom or Gavin Newsom was elected governor, it was a really logical step to join his administration and drive his environmental vision on a broader level than San Francisco, and that is, of course, California. And I worked with the Natural Resources Agency when I was in the Governor Brown's administration, and I just loved the portfolio. As you know, Don, our agency includes state parks, one of the best state park systems in the world. We have the Department of Fish and Wildlife protecting nature. We have CAL FIRE, which obviously protects us from wildfire, but is also the state's forestry agency. We have water resources, so all these questions of drought and flooding. We have all the coastal agencies, all the sort of regulatory protective agencies. We also have 10 state conservancies, which are doing really proactive conservation. Right. And then we have the California Energy Commission that's driving the clean energy revolution here in California. So for me, when Gavin Newsom was elected governor, this was certainly the job that I wanted more than any other.
Mm-hmm. Did you ask for the job?
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's great.
The fact is, these jobs, in my experience anyways, are jobs that a whole lot of people are interested in. Right. So sometimes somebody says they were minding their own business and they got tapped on the shoulder, and that may be true. But I think more times than not, if you want an opportunity like this, you really have to make it known and make the case that you're the right person for the role.
Yeah, absolutely. I certainly understand that. Well, the other thing that's happening in California and that I've been talking about quite a bit on this podcast is this environmental initiative to preserve, conserve, protect 30% of the world's biodiversity by the year 2030. And I know California's been leading the way. It's called the 30 by 30 initiative, of course. And I know in October of 2020, Governor Newsom signed his nature-based solutions executive order in 8220. So how's this order and the efforts on 30 by 30 been implemented to this point in California? Are you really having any success with it, or is it just a good idea?
Well, first of all, I think 30 by 30 is a really good idea, and we're having success and we're making progress. But at the highest level, I think the world now understands that we face this planetary crisis of climate change. I think far less people understand we face another planetary crisis that is mass extinction. We're seeing, alarming loss of different forms of life on Earth every day. And we know this is human caused. And so we have to tackle both the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis and recognize that they're two sides of the same coin, that they're interlinked. Right. And climate change, there's been so much focus on transitioning forms of energy, like moving to solar and wind and doing electric vehicles and really deploying technology to address climate change. And that's really important. But we've had a major blind spot, which is helping nature help us. How do we conserve nature across the planet to buffer these climate impacts that we're experiencing, but also remove and store carbon from our atmosphere? Because, of course, that's part of the natural carbon cycle. The more lands, healthy soils, plants there are on the surface of the planet, the more they can actually absorb carbon that's contributing to climate change. So really big idea was formed, certainly outside of California, to protect 30% of the earth by 2030. A very ambitious, but we think achievable goal to stem extinction, loss of biodiversity, and to contribute to the climate action we know we need. Right. And a group of countries have come together across the world, over 100, I think near 150 from every continent, called the High Ambition Coalition. And they signed up for this 30 by 30 target. Now in California, we're not a national government, obviously, but we're huge. Right now we are the fourth largest economy in the world if you measure our GDP versus other countries. And so we felt like it was important to step up to be part of this 30 by 30 movement and to really provide a standard by which other countries can measure their 30 by 30 efforts. So as you mentioned, Governor Newsom loved this idea, enshrined it into an executive order, which essentially is directing our agencies to help achieve it. And that really led us on the pathway to establish this 30 by 30 strategy. And we didn't do that sitting in our government agencies in Sacramento. We spent over a year across the state getting input, ideas, buy-in from communities in every corner of our state and all sorts of organizations. As you know, Don, in California, but really everywhere, there are land trusts, philanthropic entities that are helping conserve land. We have an entity called Resource Conservation Districts in California that do conservation. We have community-based organizations, local leaders, tribal governments, so important to actually reconnect tribal wisdom with our conservation. And so we spent a year with all of these leaders and developed a shared strategy to achieve this 30 by 30 target and a really strong definition of what conservation meant. So that is conserving our lands and coastal waters in a way that's principally focused on the ecological benefit and protection. So our standard, our definition is pretty strong. And under that definition right now, we've conserved about 23% of our lands and about 16% of our coastal waters. So over the next 7 years, we have to do a lot more conservation. And so we have finalized this strategy with 10 different pathways to do this. Governor Newsom and our legislature have allocated over $1 billion to move us down this pathway. And every month, Don, we're seeing our state conservancies, our local land trusts, our state departments acquire more lands for conservation, fund conservation easements, help federal agencies improve conservation on public lands to meet that target. So we're making progress, but I'll tell you, it keeps me up at night whether we're going to actually make that target here in the next 7 years.
I understand. Well, you were just at a major conference in Canada where all the countries gathered to talk about 30 by 30. And I understand they finally made a commitment. These countries came to an agreement because before it was just an idea batted about by all of these countries and it hadn't been ratified yet. Tell us what happened in Canada.
Absolutely. So it was fascinating. Over 50 leaders from California formed a delegation that went to Montreal last month, a very cold place to be for Californians, but it was a remarkably productive time. Let me just set the stage, which is some of your listeners may remember the Earth Conference in Rio in the early 1990s. And that initiated essentially 3 treaties that the United Nations was focused on establishing and strengthening across the world. One, to combat desertification or the drying of our lands. The other, to combat climate change. And you've heard a lot about that convention. The Convention on Climate Change is just another way to say an international treaty. And every year with these conference of parties, it's the nations coming together to update and to strengthen that climate change treaty. But the third one was a convention to preserve biological diversity or biodiversity. And that effort has been sort of backburnered, quite frankly. It hasn't gotten the attention and the focus and the political priority that the climate change treaty has received. And so it was a big deal when nations came together in Montreal in December to discuss how to update that treaty. It hadn't been updated in 10 years. And frankly, the targets that were set 10 years ago were not met. Right. And this conference of parties, of nations, was supposed to happen over 2 years ago in China. But as a result of the pandemic, it got postponed for the last 2 years. And so Quebec, who is a key partner of ours on the sub-national level, a province in Canada, stepped up to host this. And Don, as you said, this was a breakthrough moment because nations of the world came together to update that treaty, that agreement, and among other things, committed, each of them, all the signatories of the treaty, to achieve 30 by 30 in their own countries here in the next 7 years. Now, they didn't agree on exactly what the definition is for conservation or how that would get done, because you have to reflect, you have to recognize there needs to be a diverse approach by countries and by continents. But the target is very clear, and that is a really big deal. I will say there is only one country that is not a signatory of that treaty, and believe it or not, that's the United States.
That's what
and as a result of what has been historic Republican intransigence in the U.S. Senate, that treaty was never ratified by our Senate. However, that being said, the Biden administration has been very active. It's got an envoy on biodiversity and habitat, a woman named Monica Medina, and the U.S. was very present as a cheerleader for this treaty. So, Don, I'm optimistic. I think it's remarkable that the world is now moving toward 30 by 30, and from my perspective, in California, we can lead the way, showing how we get it done.
Right. No, I totally understand. That conference, I think, is going to be a game changer, and from what you're saying. But I also understand, and this may be a difficult question, that there are some property rights advocates that see 30 by 30 as a land grab, that threatens private property rights. I certainly heard that during my 40-year career as we were protecting the environment. It sounds like it's still going on. But how do you answer those critics? You must go to public meetings and hear from property rights folks.
Yeah. Well, I would say, first of all, this is a dynamic that's over a century old. When Teddy Roosevelt established our national forest system to preserve public lands, he encountered intense opposition from those interests that were essentially, exploiting the environment, whether it was timber interests or fossil fuel interests. And so even today in the American West, there are other states where, the politics are such that 30 by 30 feels, is a bad word or a really threatening concept, because there are some political leaders that view public lands and the protections on public lands as conflicting, their sort of economic vision for their states. That being said, we're clear in California, that is a false choice. Certainly we need to utilize resources on our land, whether it's timber or water, or the other things that help our communities and our economy prosper. Mm-hmm. At the same time, there is plenty of land to ensure that important habitats, ecosystems are protected. In California, this 30 by 30 is not a regulatory approach. It's not an approach that's going to come and take away land from private property owners. What we're focused on are voluntary actions to conserve this 7 million acres of land. Again, whether that's improving the conservation protections on lands that are already publicly managed by federal agencies, mm-hmm. or through the market acquiring new lands to be conserved, or funding voluntary conservation easements, which allow private property owners to keep the lands in their own private hands, but get resources, get funding, get paid to commit to conserving those lands in a beneficial way. So, Don, I think that opposition, frankly, is in my mind tired and outdated, and we're going to show in California how we conserve this target while enabling the housing development that we need to achieve, while enabling more renewable energy and transmission lines to overhaul our energy system. So we can get it all done. It just requires, vision and effective planning.
Well, Wade, you are in good company with Teddy Roosevelt, so keep up the good work that you're doing, battling with the private property rights folks. I know they're well-meaning, and a lot of them are great conservationists as well. And I think over time, as you were saying, all of that's gonna work out for the best. I have a couple of other questions I wanted to ask, and the main one has to do with back to 30 by 30. Is that how will you know you have achieved success, especially in California? And kind of a follow-up question to that is, what happens to all the money that Bezos and the other billionaires have pledged to this effort?
Well, I'll say 30 by 30, I think, has caught the imagination around the world and kind of galvanized the conservation movement because it's easily understood. What we're talking about is improving, durable conservation focused on maintaining the ecology of place by 2030 in the next 7 years. But it's not just a numbers game. We're doing this for a reason, and in California, we have 3 cardinal goals of 30 by 30. The first, and these are co-equal goals. The first I'll mention is to protect this incredible biodiversity that we have in California. We're one of these 36 biodiversity hotspots in the world, just given this variety of plants and animals and life forms that we have. So 30 by 30 is a down payment to protect biodiversity. We know that plants and animals, imperiled plants and animals in California need more habitat. We need places of refuge during climate, and we need more connectivity as plants and animals move as climate change progresses. So we'll measure the effectiveness of 30 by 30 on the ecological front by how are we doing on protecting our biodiversity. Second is we need to expand access to the outdoors, particularly for communities that don't have enough of it currently. Too often there's been this false choice between, having people in nature and conserving an area. And our tribal leaders tell us, of course, that people are nature and people have been at the center of nature forever. And so from our perspective, we can conserve lands and expand public access. And we want to do that in a way where at the end of the day, at 30 by 30, as a result of conservation, more places across California are open to more people. So that's number 2. And then number 3 is one of the reasons why 30 by 30 is a planetary movement is it's an important way to combat climate change. Right. We know that our lands, our forests, our plants, our oceans are an important way to remove and store carbon from the atmosphere, which is a really important part of stabilizing our climate. And so we're also going to measure ourselves in 30 by 30 with how are we doing? We're actually targeting an amount of carbon that we're going to sequester in our lands. And 30 by 30 and improving conservation, improving the ecological function of lands is really important toward doing that. So I'll say 30 by 30 is successful if, yes, we meet that goal for amount of acres more that are conserved and that amount of space in our coastal waters. That's important. But it's also if 30 by 30 is actually helping us protect biodiversity, expand equitable access, and ensure that our lands are a climate solution.
So on an international level, with all of these countries involved, did the conference put in place metrics and formal way to measure? I mean, are there people or institutions that will actually monitor what's going on over the next several years and then report back so everybody can say, hallelujah, we did it?
It's a great question, and I think that's the proverbial fine print. Whereas all of the signatories to that international treaty on biodiversity signed on to this update that was enshrined in Montreal, which includes 30 by 30. Now, it's very clear that the way that each country is going to get to 30 by 30 will differ. So there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. but nor is there a really standard prescriptive methodology for how we're measuring how a country achieves 30 by 30. There are certainly parameters or guideposts, but it's really going to be up to countries themselves, but also civil society, those groups that we're pushing for this, to hold countries accountable for making meaningful actions and actually being serious about 30 by 30, avoiding fudging it or fuzzying it up, to really identify what does 30% of the land and waters being conserved mean. I think California is going to play a leadership role because, from my perspective anyways, we've set a really clear, strong standard for what we mean by conserved lands under 30 by 30. And we're going to play a role, Don, in working to hold countries accountable for that type of standard.
Understand. So what about the money? I mean, I've heard that, billions of dollars literally are being funneled into this effort. I mean, is this money making a difference? How is it being accounted for? I mean, can you go to Bezos, for example, and say, okay, you contributed $1 billion. Is someone in your organization accounting for where that money was spent and what the outcome was?
Well, first of all, we're putting our money where our mouth is. And by that, I mean, we're investing ourselves in state government over $1 billion in the last couple of budget years to move towards 30 by 30. And certainly where we're spending public funds, there is very clear accountability. So people will know how we're actually spending those funds. We're also working with philanthropic partners to actually bring in resources. And as you know, foundations, philanthropy already fund a lot of land conservation.
Right.
There's an entity called the Weiss Foundation internationally that really drove a lot of this 30 by 30, as well as the place-based acquisitions of land for conservation or conservation easements. So while we won't be responsible for tallying up the different investments of each philanthropy, we're trying to attract as much of that as possible. Conservation is expensive, and at the end of the day, if we're ensuring that a land is primarily conserved for environmental benefit, sometimes that means buying that land and protecting it from other exploitation, or putting that conservation easement, that requirement that it be conserved, and that takes money. And again, we're really focused on this voluntary approach where we're going to identify the places where we need to get this done and then work with landowners to do that. So it's going to take a lot of money, and I am appreciative of philanthropy for stepping in, and I think it needs to hold itself accountable for ensuring strong results.
Right, understand. So back to the fact that this is the podcast, Life is a Story We Tell Ourselves, I wanted to ask you a question that I usually wrap up with, and clearly your love and enthusiasm and passion for the work that you do shines through. But so there must have been some experience in your life, particularly in the natural world, that might have been transcendent or changed you in some ways, almost in a spiritual way. Can you remember any time in your life when you had an experience that was transcendent and you felt like you came out a different person?
Yeah, well, I would say, I would bring up a fairly recent event, and that is actually during that time I was secretary. I talked earlier about some of my formative years being in nature, and I think that was really fundamental to what I do. But I had a chance to get out on the John Muir Trail for five days with a nonprofit conservancy that took some of its key supporters and then brought me along as sort of the person to talk about government and its role in conservation. And boy, I hadn't been out in nature for that long a continuous period in a while. It was just a few years back. So think, the high Sierra in the middle of summer, beautiful peaks, full moons, clear, cold streams. And it was incredible. And it really gave me a sense of joy in the work. If you work in the environmental policy field, sometimes it can feel a bit of gloom and doom, or, we're always focused on the next thing and not celebrating our victories. But, it just reminded me of how incredible this natural world is. And in California, just how beautiful and sacred, the nature is that we're protecting. So I came back from that really energized. And since that time, which was, 3 summers ago, I've made sure to get in the backcountry, even despite the craziness of the job. Because I think we need to really connect to our passion. This work is hard, and it needs to be sustained. And I think, in order to be able to do that, we have to bring an energy and a joy and a love to the work. So that's helped me do that.
Understand. Well, I think I went on that exact same trip 30 years ago, and I remember it like it was yesterday. And I have since, of course, spent a lot of time in the desolation wilderness with my children, both young and old, on the John Muir Trail. And yeah, I can verify how transformative an experience that really is. And it goes to the point that how important it is that those lands were conserved. So we're talking about it almost in the abstract. But unless you connect it to the personal experience, like so many Native Americans talk about. I had such an interaction with Native Americans during my career, because it was also during the time that the Native American Grave and Repatriation Act was established. So we had a lot of interaction with the Native American community. I can tell you how much more personal it made the work, so that every day, when you went through the difficult periods, it was always moderated by those transcendent experiences that you have, because it's all about people and their connections with the natural world. That's what makes the difference. So I can fully understand that.
Yeah, and I just think our time on this planet as individuals is pretty short, and to be able to spend a lot of our life actually working to protect this incredible, improbable planet that is our home is amazing. Truly amazing, and it's a bond that you and I have and others that get to work on this. And I think the more that we can recognize that and appreciate that and celebrate that, the better we're going to be able to do the considerable job we have ahead of us.
Well, I know the people in the state of California appreciate the work that you're doing, Mr. Secretary, and also the work that the governor and other people that work in resource protection and preservation are doing. And I know our listeners appreciate the time that you've given. Any final thoughts before we sign off here?
Well, I'll just say, let's keep it up. We face some big challenges environmentally, and obviously as we reckon with so many wrongs in our past. But, using that term that you hear sometimes, we are the people we've been waiting for. In other words, to make the world a better place, it relies on us. So I'm just really appreciative of this conversation, Don, the fact that you have such an inspirational podcast, and just thank all your listeners for doing what they do in their own lives to make this world a better place.
All right. Well, Mr. Secretary, Wade, thank you very much for joining me. And I know our listeners have enjoyed hearing what you've had to say. And I'm going to make sure that they get a link to 30 by 30 in California. And some of them have questions and comments that they send in, and I'll make sure you get those as well. Thank you very much, Wade, for joining me.
Thank you, Don. Take care until we talk again.
All right. Take care, sir. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Life is a Story We Tell Ourselves. On our next episode, Dale Greenwald will join us as we travel back in time to a real-life adventure of discovery. Dr. Greenwald will share with us how he and his team discovered ancient biomolecules and how ancient biomolecules hold the secrets to how mammoths dealt with the cold, what colors dinosaurs exhibited in mating displays, how ancient viruses evolved to become more dangerous, and much more. You can read all about it in his new book, Remnants of Ancient Life, The New Science of Old Fossils. So that you don't miss an episode, please subscribe to the podcast at lifeisastorypodcast.com. And don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoyed our podcast. be well, share happiness, and remember, never stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existing.